This week's episode is brought to you with the support of Bureau Veritas.
At Bureau Veritas, each and every one of us is by your side to help you navigate your decarbonisation journey and shape a better maritime world.
This is Green Seas, the podcast by Tradewinds about sustainability and the business of the ocean. I'm Eric Priante Martin, and today we have our third episode from my recent trip to California, this time exploring whether the U.S. state will regulate shipping's carbon emissions. Sacramento didn't wait for the International Maritime Organization when it came to shipping sulfur and nitrogen emissions, or the invasive species carried in its ballast water. And officials in the California capital may not wait for the IMO to ramp up its regulations on greenhouse gas emissions either. The California Air Resources Board, also known as CARB, is pursuing efforts to achieve further reductions in emissions that would include carbon dioxide. That's according to agency spokeswoman Linda Lambert, who told me in an email that the updated rules would also tackle additional reductions in nitrogen oxides, or NOx, particulate matter, and reactive organic gases. She said the agency is exploring potential regulatory and voluntary measures that could reduce emissions by ocean-going vessels while they're in transit to or from California ports, rather than just within them. She told me the potential measures could include the use of cleaner engines in California waters, alternative fuels or zero-emission technologies, including batteries and fuel cells. The agency is in the early stages of developing these measures and is yet to set a timeline, but typically a rulemaking takes 3 to 5 years to develop. That California could take action to regulate emissions of ships that call in its waters is music to the ears of some environmental groups. I caught up with Teresa in Sacramento, just a few minutes' walk from the CARB offices. She's the Climate Policy Director for Advocacy for Pacific Environment. The organization wants California to adopt an in-transit rule, which would regulate ocean-going ships' emissions as they move to and from the state's ports. That would dovetail with the state's requirements to cut emissions in port by using shore power in some shipping sectors.
California, they passed the first low sulfur fuel rule that the International Maritime Organization eventually adopted, and NASA has shown the global impacts of the sulfur fuel reduction. It's incredible. California also passed the first at-berth rule, which requires major ships such as cargo vessels and cruise ships to plug into shore power. And we're seeing the EU and China adopt similar policies. So as California goes, so does the rest of the nation, and so does the rest of the countries. And so we're hoping that California can lead on an in-transit rule.
As I've mentioned, regulating ocean shipping isn't new for California. Its rules on NOx, particulate matter, and sulfur oxides, or SOx, have what Lambert described as co-benefits for cutting greenhouse gas emissions. But when Sacramento has wielded its power over shipping in the past, some in the industry complained about having to face a patchwork of regulations around the world, including by subnational governments like US states, when the IMO is there to create one set of rules. The London-based UN shipping body is working to craft new measures to push shipping to its goal of net zero emissions by 2050, but there remain concerns about whether the IMO will move quickly enough.
The International Maritime Organization, while it does have a global reach, it is moving slower. And right now we're in a decade of a climate emergency. We need everyone to move as fast as possible. And we think subnational and ports all have a role to play in accelerating shipping decarbonization. So we're trying to get all stakeholders to move as fast as possible, not just at the IMO.
Bowie's group would like to see California adopt a rule that strives for zero emissions, both of greenhouse gases and other pollutants, by 2040. Before we continue, a quick message from Tradewinds technology editor, Craig Eason.
Hiya, Craig here. I just want to take a minute to tell you about Wavelength, a new podcast from Tradewinds. It's a weekly dive into some of the top news as seen from the Tradewinds editorial staff, with insights from experts within our industries. So, to keep your finger on the pulse of the shipping and maritime sectors, search for Tradewinds Wavelength on Spotify, Acast, or any of the podcast platforms that you use, and then click to follow or subscribe. Or you can visit tradewindsnews.com and search for podcasts there too. That's Tradewinds Wavelength Podcast, a new weekly podcast for both subscribers and non-subscribers alike.
Not everyone wants to see California step up on carbon emissions by shipping. Kathy Metcalf is president of the Chamber of Shipping of America. She said that greenhouse gas emissions are different than pollution like SOx and NOx, which have local impacts in port communities.
What I think people need to be reminded of is greenhouse gases and CO2 is a global problem. All right, it's not a regional problem. It's not like SOx, NOx, particulate matter. It moves. So from our perspective, the only viable solution is a global solution.
She said that even the European Union's carbon regulations, including the emissions trading system and other rules, were created to push the IMO into action. That is, even Brussels sees the need for a global program. Metcalf's group supports a global fuel levy, and she worried that action by California could help dislocate global trade patterns, and that it wouldn't be able to ensure that there are green fuels in sufficient supply to meet the demands of new regulation.
We've got to get a program that everybody can agree to start working this out. And our ultimate goal is to find a reasonable solution. We know it's going to cost more money. It's going to cost everybody more money. But we would hate to see programs put in place that collect a lot of money but don't result in environmental benefit.
One person who has looked in detail at the role California could play in reducing shipping's greenhouse emissions is David Wooley. I met up with him at the University of California's Goldman School of Public Policy, where he directs the Center for Environmental Public Policy. Wooley agreed that a global solution to shipping's carbon problem is ideal, but only if you can get it done and if it's strict enough. And while he sees momentum at the IMO, there remains a risk of insufficient action.
As we were looking around at this, we realized that there's a history of California leading in this area. And could they lead again? And so our sense was that they could. And the history being that California was the first one to limit sulfur and fuel for ocean-going vessels, limited to its coastal waters. But that action, which was very carefully done, well researched and supported by the staff there and the commissioners, led to action by the IMO to do a similar sulfur thing, but on a global scale. And somewhere in between there, the U.S. federal government on sulfur emissions and efficiency of ships. So our sense is that if California got involved with the IMO, that would have several benefits.
Brussels has taken action in that direction with its emissions trading rules and the FuelEU maritime regulation that caps fuel's carbon intensity. But Wooley believes Sacramento should get in the game too. On the one hand, California could help implement IMO standards, but it also could provide a way to move forward if the United Nations shipping body stalls.
California often leads the national government on air pollution controls, particularly for mobile sources, and this is another mobile source. And I guess the in-between of those two things is that a signal from California would accelerate this momentum and make it more likely that the IMO would adopt something that was effective and strong.
In research led by Wooley and commissioned by Pacific Environment, the Goldman School laid out several options for California to take that leadership role. The first is to create an in-transit rule, using the template from its regulations on SOx and NOx emissions to tackle greenhouse gas for voyages to and from California ports. Ships that use these ports would have to report their emissions and would have to gradually reduce them over time. The regime could look like FuelEU Maritime, which gradually limits the greenhouse gas intensity allowed in the energy sources used by shipping. Wooley has seen some appetite for this option from California officials, though he said it could take years to develop. Another option is to create a cap-and-trade system, which could include creating a carbon credit market like the EU's emissions trading regime.
If the IMO did not move forward, action by California would essentially expand in a fairly big way the geographic scope of what the Europeans were doing. And so essentially you move toward an international transition. Now it isn't complete because there is still a lot of shipping that never comes to California or European ports, but a lot of shipping will. And so this is an opportunity to gradually move toward a global regulatory system.
And a third option would be to expand the state's low-carbon fuel standard. Shipping is currently among industries exempt from the California carbon intensity regulation. In Washington, D.C., Congress has passed laws that pump funding into green fuels, and California has one of the hydrogen hubs created with support from the Biden administration. And if his opponent, Donald Trump, wins the election in November, Wooley said it will be hard to stop the momentum of the U.S. green fuel investments, but a win by the Republican former president could heighten the need for leadership by California. Wooley said action could help send additional policy signals to the industry that would provide impetus to spending on green shipping.
I think the signal is really important here because what I'm seeing is a really unusual situation, which is a highly polluting industry embracing change and is interested in doing the transition and has begun to invest fairly heavily in that. But at the same time, in order to keep that moving, they need essentially a signal that regulation is coming and what it's going to look like. Because it does take a lot of money to invest in this kind of a transition, a lot of capital.
For more stories on sustainability and shipping, visit tradewindsnews.com/sustainability. And to sign up for the Greenseas newsletter, visit tinyurl.com/greenseas. Music for this episode is by Alex Grohl, Play Sound, Ludmila Polishchuk, and Alexander Savochka from Pixabay.